The Supreme Court makes a landmark ruling protecting LGBTQ workers from job discrimination. Fox 5 legal analyst Wendy Patrick joins us now to explain what this all means. Wendy, good morning.
Good morning, Raul.
You know, what I found shocking yesterday is how many people thought they already had those protections, the LGBTQ community. They did not.
Well,
We're
fortunate to have them in California. We have a lot of protections in California. But as of yesterday, half of the states didn't have any sort of protection from being fired by your employer if you're a member of the LGBTQ community. And so what does that mean? That means legally you could have gotten married on Sunday and fired on Monday. Now, that's not to say that was happening all over the country, but it did happen. So this was a ruling that was very hard fought. For many people that were actually quite surprised that the justices broke down the way they did in terms of that 6-3 ruling. But if you were a member of that class in one of those states, you did worry about that sometimes every day, but no longer as of yesterday.
Yeah, Gorsuch voting for this was shocking to a lot of people, wouldn't you say?
Well, in a sense.
And he made the statement.
He has not become a born-again liberal, that's for sure. But he has always been a textualist. He looked at the plain meaning, so he thought, of those words, and that, of course, was the whole debate, is what did the word sex mean when they wrote? Now, I mean, it is a noun, not a verb. What did it mean when they wrote the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and what does it mean today? Back in the day, when it was written, it meant to distinguish between men and women. But that's not what it means today. That's what he said, and that's what the justices that joined him said. So he basically just looked at it, and I know the dissent says what he did was legislate, which of course is not something the Supreme Court is supposed to do, but that is the way the justices were divided. And most interestingly along those lines, two of the President Trump appointees were on opposite sides of this issue. How do you like that? You had Neil Gorsuch authoring the 33-page majority opinion and Justice Kavanaugh authoring his own dissent.
I wanted to ask kind of an obvious question of why this is so groundbreaking. Could you put it into perspective for us?
Well, putting it into perspective would be looking at what might happen now. And that's what everybody is talking about, is given the fact that this issue, the definition of sex, given that now it's been expanded to include sexual orientation and gender identity, what other cases might be ripe to take, or at least petition to the Supreme Court to be able to see, well, where else would that distinction apply? Would it be in the housing issues, Title IX, schools? How far does a ruling like this go? And would the justices be willing to expand it beyond what's there? Now, maybe not, but that's one of the issues that's going to be tested, because prior to yesterday, many people that were fighting for this didn't really think they had a chance on this issue, much less starting to brainstorm, well, in what other areas might we test this law?
Wow. Some groups were still surprised. Were you surprised that some groups were they were taken aback?
No, this is a very divisive issue, but what the Supreme Court was looking at, they weren't looking at whether or not they believe in a particular lifestyle or whether they believe in certain definitions in the religious aspect of it, for example. They were looking at the law. They were looking at the text of the 1964 Civil Rights Act and trying to determine, what did the word sex mean? That's it. And when you read the decision, they looked at a number of different factors in not only making that decision, but also in making very clear what they weren't deciding. So one of the things they addressed, for example, is, well, how does this ruling, how will it intersect with the Religious Freedom Act? And how will people that either run religious organizations or personally hold personal religious convictions, what will this look like for them? Now, that's going to be something that's going to be litigated probably sooner rather than later, if you ask me, because that's one of the things that's been on the docket for the Supreme Court for the last several years. But they were being very clear that that's not what yesterday's decision was about. But they're laying the groundwork to maybe have more refinements and future interpretation.
I mean, until more than half the states, in more than half the states, you could be fired for being gay. If you just think about that, you realize the impact that this had. The practical impact, you talked about this a little bit in terms of moving forward for workers, for companies. What is that going to look like?
Well, what it's going to look like is there's going to be very definitive guidelines in terms of making sure people understand why they're being fired. Because remember what the Supreme Court said. It didn't have to be the only reason that somebody was fired, nor did it have to be the primary reason somebody was fired. So employers that are going to terminate employees are probably going to make very good notes detailing in every segment as to why they did what they did. Because when you say it doesn't have to be the only reason or the primary reason, what the Supreme Court was saying is it can't ever be a reason that somebody is terminated. So it's no doubt going to make employers rethink, not of course in the half of the states that already have that protection, but in the half that didn't as of yesterday. So you can see why we're using the word groundbreaking. And Neil Gorsuch said it himself. He said that we almost couldn't be talking about a law of more significance than Title VII of 1964 Civil Rights Act. So it's one of the most significant acts and laws we could ever be interpreting. And it also significant in terms of its decision. So it really is a big deal. We're going to be talking about this for many days to come. And we're also going to see more litigation based on what we heard from the Supreme Court yesterday.
It was a huge historic day, to say the least. Wendy, Patrick, thank you as always.
Thanks, Raul.